So I will welcome you all here now to this nth, I've lost track, session on SmartDB. And in the past 2 or 3, it's been my partner in crime, Tone, who has taken the floor and opened up with a presentation to seed some discussion and questions. And this time I'm going to do it. And the topics that I felt that I should give some attention to and let you ask questions about are the things that are called code-based access control, or conventionally abbreviated to CBAC. You always hear the phrase CBAC roles. That's one topic. The other is something called the accessible by notion, or the whitelist notion. In purpose, it's the whitelist, and in syntax, there's a clause called accessible by. And the third thing is a notion, very PL SQL specific, and it's called inherit privileges. And in the talk that I've taken around the circuit this year, called Guarding Your Data Behind a Hard PL SQL API, Hard Shell PL SQL API, I find somehow that I just parenthetically mention those and never have time to do them justice. And so here I intend to do them justice. But it strikes me that not everyone there will know all the background. So I'm going to take the opportunity, now I'm going to share to, where's share gone? Zoom, here it is, share screen. Just give me a moment. I'm now going to find a browser. Let's just find a blank piece of screen, find a browser, and show you the quickest way, minimum keystrokes, to get to some useful collateral. So just this seems to be enough to take you to promising hits. And the best place to start, though you could circumvent by going to some of the other links, I would say is this blog. And enough about me and all that stuff. And here's the welcome and overview, where basically I'm saying we don't, me and a colleague who writes pieces here, don't write things terribly frequently, but when we do write things, we try to make them very thorough, and they usually appear as a white paper. And here is the piece that is of most interest for the moment. This whole advocacy project that I've been on now in earnest for maybe 3 years, longer, I lose track, but in some sense always, was launched by a talk called Why Use PL SQL, and I mentioned further down that there's a whole white paper and so on, and there are other posts in this blog that focus on that. That would be the way to get started on the whole topic. But by this stage now, I've done various talks, and you can see them recorded, and you can also see, perhaps more interestingly still, one by Tone Coppola. So this is now a link to a YouTube what's it called now? Playlist, I think is the word. And it's supposed to be a slightly tongue-in-cheek reality show approach, where the live performances of the substance are merged in with behind-the-scenes outtakes, me talking to various people and developing my thoughts on this whole topic area. But the talk of most interest for today, this one I mentioned, Guarding Your Data Behind a Hard Shell PL SQL API, the detail, that was recorded at the most recent Kaleidoscope, K-Scope conference in Florida in June. And the recordings come out reasonably well, I think. And I took the liberty there of taking a little bit more time than the strict hour we were allowed. But even then, I didn't have justice to do this topic of today. So there's all sorts of stuff for those who are later to the party to dip into and to get up to speed. Right, enough of that. Let's just go back to the slide deck that I have for today. And what I did was take an extract from that long talk that I'm going to rush through, because I'm not confident enough that everyone is on the basic same wavelength of the thinking about this. So there's been a fair amount of talk on Twitter and in other places about exactly what we mean by SmartDB, or the smart database paradigm. And as you see, we have a Twitter hashtag that goes with it. And in particular, recently, our dear friend Philip Salvisborg, who I'd hoped would be here today but isn't, introduced a notion he calls PinkDB, with correspondingly the obvious hashtag. And I think that came from a background of he in particular being very eager to pin me and tone down to a very precise definition of what we mean. And I think he'd fallen into, I had somehow tricked him, let's say, into thinking that all sorts of things I say, like I'm going to say today, are an essential part of the definition. But I don't want you to think that. This, I think, is the terse and appropriate definition of our smart database paradigm. And it's as simple as this: by a conventional regime of credentialed publication, there's a database and there's client code that connects, and it would be a miracle if anyone set up any regime where ordinary client code could connect as sys. And from that, you can deduce that client code is given credentials of certain users so that it can connect and do stuff. And it's not given the credentials of other users who are considered to be more private within the database. And it's very simple to arrange that you give credentials out to the outside world only for schemas. There's no reason why it should be only one, but it's easier to talk as if it's one, but only to schemas which are empty of objects and which, when they are created, have zero privileges apart from the obvious create session. That's the starting point. We won't fuss with whatever public brings. There's no sensible way to talk that, and we'll leave that out of the picture. And then that empty, or I should say the user who owns that empty schema, is given exactly and only execute privileges on a well-defined set of PL SQL subprograms who have been designed to be the API of the application backend that the database hosts to the outside world. And that means that by construction, the only sensible thing, well, I should say the only thing at all that you can do, if we don't trouble ourselves with select star from all users or something silly like that, is execute these API subprograms. And they are designed to be single operations. So it would be very funny if you wrote begin and then API number 1, API number 2, and so on. But there's no way to stop anyone doing that. But the spirit of it is that each time you do a top-level database call, you call just one subprogram. And indeed, it's the case that this very straightforward procedural set of steps ensures that the people who know the credentials you've given out can only invoke your API subprograms. And that is the smart database paradigm. Everything else that we say under the umbrella of it is, let's say, recommendations, icing on the cake, and notions that could be useful as applications get bigger and bigger and more complex. But you can see that a straight corollary of that statement of the paradigm is that obviously we assume that there's tables and someone's going to put stuff in and get stuff out by select. Where are those SQLs going to come from? Well, they cannot come from the outside world by construction. In other words, the insert, update, delete, commit, of course, and select statements that are issued, that must be issued to implement the application's purpose, they can only come out of PL SQL code inside the database, okay? So if I state the paradigm as I did at first, then this bit here, let me highlight it, is not a statement of the paradigm. It's a theorem that you could deduce from the axiom that is the paradigm, okay? And now this bit has troubled a lot of people. It's not exactly, it's not at all a requirement that you use only static SQL. It's just a happy fact that the huge majority of requirements for SQL in ordinary OLTP applications are well met by PL SQL static SQL. And that's why I've got the word probably there. And there's a huge advantage in using static SQL, of course, because of all the rich metadata that you can get to learn various properties of the application in a heartbeat. Like these days in 12.2, where are the inserts happening? And what tables are involved in what inserts at what statement locations, right? Just by querying up the right metadata tables. And this one here is hugely contentious. My point, and Tone's too, is that SQL is a very natural language. It maps perfectly onto the way people talk about the information requirements in the business world, all this entity relationship modeling stuff that maps so directly onto tables. And if you write your SQL ordinarily by human hand, well, it's not going to be that difficult in the common case because it wraps, or I should say maps, so obviously to the real world that your application is modeling. That's not to say that there's anything in the smart database paradigm that prohibits generated SQL, not at all. And there was a huge misunderstanding about that in Twitter. Rather, it means that it's not particularly remarkable if one writes SQL to achieve the end goal. There's got to be programming involved. Some of the programming is in PL SQL and some of it is in SQL. And those two languages are a very natural fit for the task at hand, that's all. And then the next bit, again, it would be so sensible and proper to exploit the full set-based power of SQL. You can get correct results if you do row by row, slow by slow, but why would you do that if you understand SQL, which you would, and if you write the stuff by hand, which you're likely to find easy enough that you wouldn't worry about doing it any other way. And the same goes for using all the bulk binding constructs. So that was meant to be brief, but it wasn't that brief. I apologize, but I hope that's clear. So everything I say today about CBAC roles, inherent privileges, and so on, they're not defining properties of the smart database paradigm, not at all. They're just my recommendations for how, particularly if you have a big and complex application, you can organize your world and, in one sense, I can say, get maximum benefit from computer checkable documentation. That's a rather abstract way of putting it, but you'll see what I mean presently. So I'm going to now rush through this animation. And this is part of that talk that you can watch if you're so motivated on the recording. 70 minutes, it would be 70 minutes well spent, I'd say. But this is just building up the whole picture. There's got to be tables. And here I've got the tables in their own schema. And I should stress, I mean, a family of schemas if it suits your purposes. Some tables for this, some tables for that. The idea is that if you put different objects of different kinds in different schemas, you will be materializing a classification scheme. I'm not mandating any particular classification scheme, but this seems very sensible. And then we have our code in a different schema, not, I should stress, because this brings special security properties at runtime, though it does have special advantages at install time, but that would be next month's talk, but rather just as a way, as I said before, of materializing a very natural classification scheme. And then we have the exposure. I might call this the inner shell. I was talking to Tone earlier today about this, and we suddenly found that it would be good to have that word there, the inner shell. By the way, these round circles represent the PL SQL subprograms, or PL SQL units, I should better say, and they're white, indicating their status as invokers' rights. And I hope I can assume that everyone understands the distinction between invokers' rights and definers' rights. And this blue API is a very particular thing. It's the exposure of the functionality where each particular subprogram, where the set of them jointly define the API, is singled out to be its own unit. And for various reasons, we prefer not a freestanding procedure or function, but rather a package with just a single subprogram in it. The principal reason for this is that when you have execute on a package, you can read its source in the spec, but not the body. But when you have execute on a procedure, you can read the whole gory detail of the implementation too, and we don't want people outside the database to do that. So this API, the blue one, has the functionality of the app exposed through what I could call conventionally parameterized PL SQL, where you've got index by PLS integer table of record and that kind of thing. And then this now, the JSON shim, is something which is attractive in today's world. And the JSON shim is an entirely non-semantic component. And as software engineering encourages us to do, it's single purpose. It just maps the invocation request parameterized in JSON to the same invocation request parameterized in ordinary IBs of records and that kind of thing. And if it's a function and there's something to be returned, it maps the conventionally parameterized return from the function into a JSON representation. That's what I mean when I say it has no semantic contribution. It's just a protocol translator. Now let's put the flesh on for today. By the way, this point here just stresses that there could be some components, these here, which are interesting for some kind of client, say written in OCI, or interesting for this. There's no requirement that every single one of these that's interesting for some kind of client happens to be interesting for these as well. That's a minor point. Now, what did we do on the next one? We just completed that picture with some detail that's almost too much to come to in any kind of talk, but the basic idea is that if all your things are invokers' rights, fair enough, but you're going to want to pass information from place to place, and you're going to benefit from universally visible, globally visible data type declarations, like, for example, something which is the row type of some table, or something which is a collection of the row type from some table. And it's natural to put all those in a package. The only point about that package being definers' rights, that's what the black is it's a kind of statement of the documentation, if you like, because we know that the invokers' rights distinction, the invokers' rights, definers' rights distinction affects only the SQL that's issued from a unit at runtime. And if a package has no SQL part in it, it's just a set of declarations, then its status as invokers' rights or invokers' rights or definers' rights is irrelevant. And so as a kind of documentation underscore, I've made it definers' rights. I hope that's clear too. So then this is today's topic, because after all, these guys here who are exposed, if you want, to conventionally parameterized clients like OCI and JDBC, and these guys here who are going to be called through some kind of internet protocol and a translator into Oracle Net. Typically, you'd expect that to be done by this ORDS component. These have to be executable by the outside world. These are the famous ones which live in, or at least which will be exposed, and we'll come to that in a minute, by a connect schema. But these are the ones that have to be equipped to do their task. And at the moment, because everything is defined as right, they are impotent because they can't do any SQL. So this is where the CBAC roles come in. And this is today's topic. And we'll show later in a moment with an example how we can very selectively give each individual unit the exact set of privileges that it needs to do its specified task, which would be different from those needed by another one to do its specified task, while they all, for convenience, live in the same schema, okay? And I can make the main point about the thing right away. And that is, if you could take the time and effort in 11.2, before this CBAC role business existed, to put each one of these, this one, this one, this one, to put, sorry, that highlight didn't work very well, to put every single one of them in its own schema and make it define as rights, and then grant the owner of the schema the exact and only privileges that that single subprogram needed to operate, you would have achieved the same effect as I'm talking about now, okay? So this new feature that I'll dwell on in a moment has the final effect of having every individual thing in its own schema and privileging up the owner of that, but the benefit that you find it so much easier to manage. No one, I don't think, would have actually taken the hit of putting every individual subprogram in its own schema to get that privilege benefit before. Now you can. Now, what is the motivating whole force behind this approach? Let me spell it out now. And I know I've used this word before, but I'm quite fond of it. It's an axiom. And the axiom is the principle of least privilege. It states that when you do any operation, obviously you should do it with sufficient privilege, but you should do it with exactly and only that sufficient privilege and not a single hint or sniff of a superfluous privilege. And I say it's an axiom, meaning it's unchallengeable. It's just what we start with. You could have a separate discussion to try and challenge it, but I think that would be futile because the whole world, especially these days with so many bad guys around, subscribes to the common sense of that principle to the extent that it's elevated to axiom status. And if we start with that axiom, well, we are just forced to follow its wisdom. And then we just have to look for a mechanism. The question is, how do we ensure that one of these, if it's only going to insert into tables A and B, can do exactly and only that and can't insert into table C? Well, we've got in 11.2 only one choice that was unwieldy. Now we've got the CBAC roles. Why have I put them here in the blue part and not here in the gray part? Exactly because these are, if you like, the ultimate gift of semantic, and this gray part is semantics free. Right then, now just to complete this box, it's these red diamonds. In a sense, I'm sorry that I came to it last, but in another sense, it's good to finish on the whole climax, the whole point. These diamonds represent the endpoints, the targets of the execute grant on these elements here. And this gray box is the schema, or better said, the set of schemas whose owners have credentials, which credentials are given out to the outside world. To put that another way, the outside world is able to connect only to the set of schemas in this gray part of our classification scheme. And therefore we have the smart database paradigm enforced operationally by that mechanism. There's a little bit more detail. We're going to need some error handling. That's not today's topic. And we're going to need someone who can log on and mine the error logs and so on. That's not today's topic. There we are. This now, I hope you saw what happened there. Now we bring in the outside world. And as far I've illustrated it here with the JSON part of it and the icon for the ORDS and the firewall world, and here the guys in seats, you don't need any other moving parts. I should say that the browser is richly programmed in some modern style using, for example, Oracle Jet, JavaScript, but the odds in this way of thinking about things is semantics free. It's another translator translating RPC, remote procedure call over HTTP, through to ordinary Oracle Net, so you can work against the database. So there we are, and I thought this little statement by a very good speaker called Ted Neward, who operates in this general space of software architecture. He gave a keynote at the Riga Dev Days, and he said that an architecture, by the way, his rather more general statement was that an architecture is a sort of scheme that provides answers to developers to all the questions that they'll come across while they're implementing something. And his main point here is that it's not utterly prescriptive. It provides signposts, but not guardrails. In other words, I'm not saying with this diagram that this is exactly the way you should do it. Rather, I'm giving you all sorts of ideas that help you think appropriately to do it in a sensible fashion. But I rather like this scheme here. So there we are. And now we're on to CBAC roles. And I hope that wasn't too much waffle. I hope I can get through this stuff. Now, I thought here I would take a risk and not do it with slides, but do it with a live demo. There's always a risk in a live demo, not that it won't work so much as I'll just fumble my awful typing. But while I'm up at the screen, what have we got here? We've just got some text editor that I like to use and a completely ordinary SQL Plus. And the SQL Plus is just idling at the moment. And I always like to emphasize this, though it's beside today's point in one sense, but I'll do it now. I've got just at one menu click here, the ability to drop the PDB. Obviously, I'm in the modern world, 12.2, and I'm using PDBs. I can drop the PDB that I'm using as my sandbox and reinstate it from an unplugged gold master. There's nothing special in it. It's basically the freshly created PDB with just a couple of tweaks, you know, certain parameters like warnings turned on, that sort of thing. There you are. It was under 10 seconds. And just think how liberating it is if you set yourself up with an environment like that, because you could log on as sys. Obviously, this is your own laptop, your God. You could do direct DML in the obj dollar table for the sport if you wanted to check some thing that you thought was, you know, helpful. And then 10 seconds later, you're back where you started. It's a complete liberation. So then, now I'm going to move on to the CBAC demo. And I should just say that it begins with a reset. And what's the reset? Well, the reset connects as sys. I don't need to show you the detail of that. When I'm connecting as sys, that's just my careless way of connecting as some suitably privileged administrative user. And so I've got a clean start. I'm dropping a role that I'm later going to create, making sure I do it silently. Standard use of PL SQL, which I rarely see, but I always like to encourage people to do it. And here I'm just going to create two users. They're same as each other, so I've, you know, not repeated myself, but I'm just equipping them with create session and create procedure. That's all we need for the demo. And another thing I like to do, and I encourage you to think about doing this, is to go to that little trouble rather than using Scott, because now you're very explicit about the privileges that you are using, and you won't make assumptions and fall into mistakes later on. So that's very simple, isn't it? We don't need to see that again, but I'm just going to do my reset and then connect as sys, so I can do a little bit more in this case. Okay, this is a generic reset that will be useful later on too. And now I'm going to just privilege up U1 a little bit further by letting him create tables with a self-populating surrogate key. There we are. And I'm going to create a role. It doesn't matter what I call it, and a role is a role. There's no flavoring of a role. It's just its use that makes it a code-based access control role, a CBAC role. And in order that it can serve its purpose, I have to grant it to the owner. I'll emphasize this point when we come to it in a moment. The owner of the PL SQL unit that is going to have a CBAC role granted to it needs to have the role already granted to that owner. And the way to do that is, as they say, with delegate option. So then let's just do it. Nothing particularly to see. Obviously, I've written this so it's not going to go wrong. And now we're just going to connect as our guy, create a silly little table with a self-populating primary key and a varchar2 column, and create a procedure who just sticks in the text that you give it. Okay, and we will just try it out by inserting dog. And obviously this must work, unless I fumble my mouse. It's no surprise what we have in T at the moment. There we are. That's why I said that live demos were dangerous. They show how terrible a typist I am. So moving on then, now we will grant execute on this. I'm setting myself up to fail now, in case you hadn't noticed. I'm going to grant execute on this to the other guy, connect to the other guy, and try to insert cat1 actually. What's going to happen? Obviously, we're going to get an error, because if I didn't stress it enough, I'm going to stress it now. This guy here is auth ID current user, what we conventionally pronounce as invokers rights. Okay, and that means that the other user, U2, is going to be the one whose privileges reign at runtime, and U2 doesn't have any privileges to operate on the table, and so we're going to get this error, right? The error here, table of view doesn't exist, completely expected. So how are we going to rescue this? We're going to go back. Oh, by the way, just a tiny detail. Notice that I've schema qualified this. I have to do that because the name resolution 2 happens in the domain of the current user. And if I hadn't put U1 there, the code would have been looking for a U2, but that's not what I want, a U2.t. I want this one over here. So then I'm going to grant execute. We did all that lot. Now I'm going to go back to U1, and now I'm going to set up my CBAC role so that it has the right privilege. In this case, I just need insert on the table in question, and then I'm going to grant the role to the procedure. So this is the new stuff. To be very precise, it's this, the yellow line. You couldn't do that in 11.2. You can do it in 11.1. Grant my role to procedure u1.p. Okay, and now where has that left us? It's left us such that when we now go back and try to insert a second cat, we don't get an error. We can't select from the table. I hope that's obvious too. Even if I were to say u1.t, because we haven't set up to do that, and that's what we want. But if we go back into U1 just to double check, then sure enough, we achieved our result. So that is exactly and only what I intended to show you and talk about in the treatment of CBAC roles. So Stephen, I hope you can see if there has been any chat or if there's still coming some chat. Let me go back to my face for the time being. And does anyone want to ask a question?
So Bryn, Sven made a comment early on.
Yes.
I'm hearing an echo. Anyway,
okay.
The difference between DB would be that selection.
Sorry, one more time. I couldn't hear that quite.
The difference with DB would be that select statements are view APIs are allowed. In other words, not having to use the table function to do a select. And I feel that is one of the restrictions that makes SmartDB hard to implement.
Yes. That's got nothing to do with CBAC roles. It's a general comment on smart versus pink. Yes. And is that Sven Veller out there? I didn't see the list. Yes. Right. Well, we're going to have a full-on debate about this at the upcoming DOAG, to which I'm very much looking forward. I think the important thing is to have, and now we do have it, some simple, memorable terminology. Never mind if SmartDB is good or bad, or PinkDB is good or bad. It's exactly the definition that SmartDB does not allow views as part of the exposure to the outside world, while Pink does. I'll say why I think that the SmartDB is a good approach. And let's say it's a good approach when you're in a certain kind of critical space. And it's this, it's just the classic abstract reasoning. I'm not going to defend the idea that software should be constructed using the principles of modular construction. This is decades old wisdom. I always open my talks with this point. No end of esteemed computer scientists have so often said that the whole point of that paradigm is to encapsulate noticeably distinct and coherent units of functionality behind a purpose-oriented API and to hide all the implementation, right? Well, anything to do with how the data is even represented is all the world of the implementation. And if you expose views, even though they are some kind of abstraction, they're not the actual tables, and they can give whatever names they want, and they can even expose various join things and hide the under the cover structure. They are nevertheless the externalization of a relational model. But the fact that you have a relational model is not the concern of the client. The concern of the client is simply to get the purposes done, having gathered the information from wherever it comes, and then present the information back to wherever it needs to go. That's the, if you like, just the pure interpretation of ordinary modular programming constructions. Now, the other thing is to do with skills. If you expose the database pink style, well, someone whose purposes is to do client-side code, UI code, is writing SQL. Well, that's, again, a breaking of the normal separation of concerns. So the reason that this smart thing is so popular is practical. It's that there happen to exist UI generators, and Apex is the canonical example that happen to have been written in the tradition of window on table, you know. And I'm not going to say anything good or bad about Apex. Well, I'd say something good. It's famous for being phenomenally productive for a certain kind of thing, but that productivity brings with it what it brings with. Well, there you have it. And in the discussion I was showing, I was envisaging a world where we're using a different kind of UI, where admittedly there's less generation. That's this JavaScript, very, very rich browser stuff. So I don't think there's any more I can say on that topic now. Are there any questions about the CBAC business?
There's one comment here. When trying to provide grants required a SysDBA, can we handle that situation? Sanjeev, you might want to provide some additional clarification on that.
No, I'll just speak to the theme. I've got a sense of what it's about. This is a topic which I'll return to in the next session. But the basic idea is there has to be some bootstrap. Someone has to create roles. Someone has to create users and so on. That will be the basic scaffolding on which your application sits. Now, once that scaffolding has been put in place, the more ordinary application developers, or their agents now who are running the scripts they wrote in the production system, never need those powerful privileges again. So I think that the creation of the CBAC role and the granting of it to a user who will need it, that's a one-off task by someone who has the right privileges, okay? Now that, if you want to call it a high-powered administrator, we often sort of call it the DBA role, yes? It's not SysDBA as such, it's the more properly said, the DBA role. There's nothing scary about that. There just has to be a bootstrap. And yes, I think I can see something coming in there. Yes, the creation of the roles, which will later be used as CBAC roles, is part of the bootstrap, because you don't want the regular application installation scripts to be able to create roles, okay? Because that's more privilege than they need for normal use. If you see later on the need for another role for another purpose, that's where you have a one-off negotiation with the high-powered administrator of the installed system to set up another thing for you. I hope that's clear. Looking at the clock, I think that clear or not, we should now move on. So I'm going to go back to the share because we've got two other topics to cover. Back to the slides, which are here. And now we're coming back into the slide zone, and we'll talk about accessible by. This is very simple to talk about, and you might wonder why I'm advocating its use. It's perhaps the advocacy part of it that will puzzle you more than the mechanics of it. So it was brand new in 12.1 and enhanced in 12.2. I'm unashamedly, as product manager for this lot, interested in the current modern world, not particularly in compromises you would make if you're still on older releases. Naturally, I want to get you fired up to think about the value that the current functionality brings. So the notion is best explained by a simple use case, and then I can show you some of the detail. I don't need anything. I suppose I should show you my face at this stage. It's a bit hard to switch backwards and forwards, sorry about that, but I will do it, and then I'll come back to the slide in a second. It's this. Imagine the situation that you've got a package that's become quite big, and it's tedious to see it all in one eyeful. And you realize that half of it is very definitely of a certain status. You could consider those subprograms in that half as being lowly helpers for the major work. And they can be separated out. You could so easily separate this one big package into two, and that's a very attractive prospect. Now, if before 12.1 you were to do that, and if there were various other things in the same schema, you would have then broken the encapsulation. Because let's face it, before you split the package, you did not expose these helpers in the package spec. Why? Well, because you felt they were private. You didn't want to give them that elevated status. You didn't want them to make them available anywhere except where you had purposely written them for. Okay. Now, how can you get your cake and eat it? How can you split that one package into two and still retain the outcome that the items in the split out package, the helper package, which now clearly must be in the spec to be visible to the help E? How can you get that cake and still not get the risk that other clients will inadvisedly use those? Simple. You state it in a whitelist. And now back to the slides. I can show you the syntax. Oh, what the hell is this? Wrong button. Start screen. Start share. So now back to the slides, which are here, and to some simple code. So this is how it looks. It's not very difficult. And the interesting thing is that new in 12.2, the granularity of this is the individual subprogram within a package, while in 12.1, it could only be what it still can be if you want, which is at the whole package granularity. But if you think about it in the more general case, this fine-grained granularity of exposure is important. Now, if you don't write the accessible by clause, which is of course the only choice you had in 11.2, well, you've said nothing. And if in 12.1 you say nothing, then it's like it used to be in 11.2, namely all the subprograms in a particular package are visible everywhere, can be compiled against. That's what really visible means. You can do a PL SQL compilation and refer to the guy in question. Now, the minute you introduce the accessible by clause, you've established a whitelist, and the whitelist, namely X, says what's on it, and anything that's not on it doesn't have to be enumerated by obvious deduction. Y is not accessible. You've said deliberately that X and only X is, or X and A, and only those are. So here's another package spec. It's called Q, and notice that Q is not X. So if you try to write this thing, if you try to compile it, because it's making a reference to this element which hasn't been made accessible to it, well, you'll get a compilation error. It's as simple as that. Now, why do I think that taking advantage of this mechanism is a good thing? What I'm advocating is that every package that you write, and by the way, you're only going to be writing packages, let's face it, for various other reasons. Every package you write, which quite probably has 2 or several subprograms in it, except the singletons at the hard shell. Every one of them is going to have an accessible by list, and you're going to list up exactly and only what you intend. Why do I recommend that? That precisely what I said at the start, because that is computer enforced or computer checked documentation. If you've written accessible by in all the places you intended and put the right stuff in it, and if your whole system compiles, well, that's a good thing. Then when you go back to the source code and wonder in some, bug diagnosis pass, if you wonder who could be calling this, where could the problems be coming from? I've just noticed something. There's many things you can look at, dependency graphs and so on, but nothing is so simple as just reading in the source text that this guy is accessible by only this, this, and this, and this. And if it's not accessible by something else, you don't have to even concern yourself. So will the world end if you don't use this mechanism? No. Is this an intrinsic part of the definition of the smart database paradigm? No. Does it improve clarity and self-documentation? I think yes. You can make your own mind up. That's all I have to say on this topic. So are there any other questions?
Bryn, there is a question back about CBAC.
Yes. Oh, that. Okay. Fair enough.
So you create one CBAC role for each of the individual single procedure packages with only the exact privileges needed for that procedure?
Yes, yes, yes. But I think it was said in a slightly confusing way. Let me go back to the diagram. But I think the spirit of it is basically correct. But as ever, we have to be such sticklers for terminology here. Where has it gone here? This is the thing, right? So these subprograms here, as the fact that 2 red arrows go to it indicates, sorry, these packages, as it's indicated by 2 red arrows going to it, can have as many or as few subprograms exposed in their specs as suits your organization principles. But these, the ones that define the API, they must be singletons. Each is a package, and each package has exactly one function or procedure in it. Why do I say exactly one? Because these are going to be the targets of the CBAC roles. That's what these little brown arrows are. And you want specificity. If you reused the role X on 2 different API members, well, you would be clearly giving each the union of the privileges that both need, which is not the principle of least privilege. So exactly to obtain the principle of least privilege, you need not only to use these CBAC roles, but to use each of them, to apply each of them to a unit that has just one subprogram in it. Does that answer the question? I'm going to assume yes, and now I'm going to carry on because we now have 10 minutes left, and I hope I can get this last bit done. Inherit privileges. And just as I said about accessible by, I'll say the same here now. Will the world stop if you don't make use of this apparatus? No. Will, Tono, I think you're not following the smart database paradigm if you don't take advantage of inherit privileges? No. I already made the crisp definition of the smart database paradigm right at the start. So this is just something I recommend. It seems to make sense to me. It seems to be very definitely in this spirit of least privileges, which you could say, put another way, is being explicit about everything you do in the privileged domain. Just don't let anything appear to work by default and not wonder if you're overprivileged. Start from failure because you haven't got enough privilege, and then add what you need. So then, this is the point. Why did we have it? Consider a scenario. Consider, just suppose it were the case that Oracle had actually shipped code owned by sys or correspondingly highly privileged users, CTX, sys, you name it. Suppose it had shipped code that had an injection vulnerability, okay? And just suppose that the vulnerability had the character that it would let the evildoer lure that code into calling a specified procedure. Let's say scott.p, scott.evil, right? Someone who can log on as Scott and can write a procedure called evil, who, for example, grants DBA to Scott. That's the classic example, isn't it? Execute immediate, grant DBA to Scott. There you've got it, scott.evil. Now you've just got to find someone who, and clearly you've written this in Voca's rights. Now you've got to find someone who will be your agent, who will run it for you. And you've got this possibility if there's an injection risk. So we thought that obviously we should make sure there are no such injection risks, but let's say over the top of all that lot, blanket of assertive prohibition against that sort of thing going on would be better still. And that's what this business is here. So I've explained these 2 bullet points. The new feature then closes the loophole because of this notion. I suppose I should explain the notion very carefully now. In the scenario that Scott has persuaded sys to invoke Scott's invokers rights privilege, invokers rights package, such that Scott's package is now running with sys's privileges, we would say that Scott has inherited sys's privileges, okay? And we don't want that to happen by default. It did used to happen by default in 11.2 and earlier. In 12.1 it doesn't. Scott will be able to succeed in that attempt only if sys has very deliberately said, okay, Scott, you may inherit my privileges. Of course, he would never say that for someone like Scott, but he might just say it for someone like CTX sys. So that's the basic principle of it. So to introduce this new feature, what we did was invent this privilege and then ship the database or make as a consequence of an upgrade to the new database, such that sys and various other powerful guys like that have revoked inherit privilege, if they had ever had it before, from the whole world, in other words, public, and have granted it very selectively only to a few other members in their club, okay? And that means that now in this exploit I described, Scott would fail, even though he'd granted, well, even though he'd got the thing that would have worked in 11.2, now it wouldn't. Now, what about the rest of the world, though? There's this follow-on requirement. We couldn't break anything, but there was one caveat there. You know, we're not going to support something which we'd already said you should never be doing. The basic idea, though, is that all ordinary users, like Scott and so on, they just grant inherit privileges to public, so that a network of mutually invoking invokers' rights privileges, like I showed in my picture, invokers' rights units, like I showed in my picture, they would just run as they used to in 11.2, because all those owners have implicitly, as part of their creation or their upgrade to 12.1, they've got this property that they have granted inherit privileges to public, okay? I'm not going to fuss about this one now. It's too much detail for the time we have left. So here's a simple demo. I could show it to you, but in a sense, there's nothing to see when I do it, except what you see when I talk about it. We're just going to create 2 Scott-like users here. By that I mean that they have connect and obviously create procedure and nothing else, following my general scheme. Well, then we connect as the first one, U1, and we create a procedure. So by U1, and it says I'm this procedure in U1. And because we intend you to use it, we grant it to U2. And then we connect as U2, we create this procedure who indeed invokes U1, and we run it, and it all works exactly as expected. Because here, we didn't say anything deliberate. This is 12.2, but we didn't say anything deliberate, so we are simply getting the consequence of this default regime, which was designed to make sure that you did get what you were used to. But now we can turn on the pressure. And so what we do now, still connected as U2, I suppose I should, no, this is the best place to make the point now. I'm going to say that me as U2 is not going to allow any Joe random user to invoke my invokers rights units. I'm just going to invoke everything from the whole world, because I imagine now that as U2, I've got some scary privileges, like, for example, create any procedure. And it's well known that if a user has create any procedure, he can trivially escalate himself up to be God. So then, what happens now, if we try to run this procedure, which in turn is calling U1's procedure, where U1's procedure now will be running in U2's privileged domain, it says, well, you didn't allow that, so this is the error you get, okay? I've turned that off. And then now it's very easy to get back to something where it all works again. I'm not going to grant inherent privileges to public, of course, because that would be back to where I started. I'm just going to do it selectively. I'm saying now, me, U2, as the guy who has some scary privilege, really, really, really knows that U1, because I'm able to read his code, I'm controlling him, has a bona fide purpose, and this is all going to be good. So there we are. I'm doing it exactly like that, and having done that, everything works again. We're back to where we were. Now, I always find that it takes a fair bit for this explanation to sink in, and even though I've given it many times, I find if I haven't spoken it through for a few months, I have to concentrate a fair bit to work it back up to speed. But that's the easy bit. The hard bit is trying to persuade you that I think there's any value in doing any of this rather than not. And the only way I can persuade you that it's valuable is by focusing attention on this line here. And what I'm there emphasizing is that I am saying very explicitly what I want. I've written this procedure, or all procedures as it happens, owned by U2, such that they are going to be able to invoke invokers' rights procedures owned by U1, because that's my purpose. And if I don't intend them to to invoke procedures owned by X, then I don't say it here. And by not saying it there, I've just locked down my whole regime. I'm just excluding degrees of freedom that I don't want to have to spend intellectual energy analyzing to see if there's some risk involved there. There we are. That's the strongest I can say it. And there we are, done. With 2 minutes left, let me come out of share and let me see if, stop share, if...
2 questions, Bryn.
Yes, right.
First question from Edith. What would be a good reason to make the API packages invoker rights with CBAC roles versus making them definer rights?
Oh, it's a strange question. I said that very carefully many times. I'll repeat it. It's exactly to get the principle of least privilege. If you had all your API packages, all your API subprograms, let's assume for the time being, they're still in singleton packages, but that suddenly becomes an uninteresting point. If you had all your API subprograms in a single schema with a single owner, therefore, then to make them all able to work, all of them, you would have to grant to the owner of the schema the union of the privileges that each individually needed, such that when each of them ran, it ran not only with what it, in the regime of not only what it needed, but a ton of other privileges that it didn't need. Well, that is not the principle of least privilege. It's the principle of lots of sloppily added superfluous privileges. And I said I'm starting with the axiom that the world of security specialists and computer scientists honoring those principles just subscribes to the principle of least privilege. So I worked out how it can be met. Does that make sense?
Hopefully. Next question. So the inherit privileges only applies to invoker rights procedures, but not to definer rights procedures?
Yes, because it's intrinsic in the notion of invoker's rights. Invoker's rights is exactly that. When an invoker's rights unit runs, executes, then the SQL it does executes in the privileged regime of the invoking user. And this inherit privileges is a scheme to let's say, lock down what can be done in that domain. Yes, it's a meaningless concept for diviner's rights.
All right, thank you. There's a question from way back. It may be something you want to take up in the next call. But anyway, well, you showed an example for an insert. How would a typical select look like in the SmartDB paradigm? Oh,
I see. Well, let me get back the slide. We'll have to give a very, very brief answer, of course, but I think I can.
That was my concern.
I'm not known for my brevity, but we'll try. This was it, wasn't it? Well, it would be a function, because this is the PL SQL parameterization. So it would be my value, V gets my do the select procedure. And the input would be whatever parameters you wanted, the employee ID or all sorts of things. Suppose that it was a master detail query you were doing. Under the covers, you'd probably implement it as a regular join. And under the covers, you would do the kind of thing that SQL Plus does when you do that break on business. And then you would present back a compound value, which would be an instance of a data type, which I imagine here would be a record, some of whose fields are scalars, being the attributes of the master, and then one of whose fields is itself a collection, being a collection of the attributes of the details. Yes? So you would do all that conversion in the implementation of your PL SQL so that you have just implemented a obvious parameterization of the task at hand. The task at hand is, here's some criteria, now do me a master detail report on the basis of those. And what does a master detail report look like? It's got facts about the master and then n repetitions of the same corresponding facts about each detail. Did that answer the question?
Hard to know. That was from Sven.
And if it's JSONified, of course, well, it's just one step further. JSON has a way of representing such a compound value.
Okay, I think that's it for questions, Bryn. Thanks.
Okay, then. Good. Thank you all for now. Thanks for your attention and your attendance. And at least I'll see some of you in DOAG in November. Bye for now.